Hello, welcome to Workplace Wake Up. I'm Jen Shaw. Every week, I spend about 15 minutes covering key legal developments, introducing you to interesting guests, and providing some entertainment to start your workday. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So happy to have Julia Melnicoe Insel with us. Many of you work with her on your employee handbooks and your manuals and your policies. Good morning, Julia.
Good morning. How are you, Jen?
I'm good. Thank you. I'm so glad to have you here. So as you know, we're having this webinar coming up about employee handbooks. And I think a lot of people think it's just kind of about what you need to do to comply with the new laws. But actually, preparing policies and handbooks is kind of an art, right?
Right. And so what we've tried to do over the last few years is for the people that want to attend this handbook seminar, we try to think about, okay, beyond just what the laws say, how can we improve our handbook every time we revise it? What are we really trying to do with it? And are we making the most of our policies? And one thing I definitely want to talk about this year is if a policy isn't working, how do you troubleshoot it? Because I've been getting a lot of questions about that lately. And I think it's such an important topic.
It really is. And I think for some of us, we think of the employee handbook as just kind of a box we need to check every year. And sometimes every decade, right? We don't necessarily do it on an annual basis, but we should, because certainly in California, the legislature always has something that is going to affect our policies. But more importantly, when you're trying to prevent legal liability, when you're trying to prevent a lawsuit, you have to have policies that not only comply with the law, but actually work. Like you said, they actually do what they're intended to do. And that means you can't always just download something from the internet or take somebody else's policy that they've used. You actually have to figure out what is going on in your workplace. And that takes more effort, right?
Definitely. And one of the things we'll be talking about in the webinar is what is the purpose of each policy? Because it's not necessarily consistent. So there are some policies we just have to have as a matter of law. And those have to contain really, really specific information. We can't mess with them that much. And those ones are the ones that people often send to us for legal review. We have some policies that are there to protect us, and we may think they feel a little over the top and heavy-handed. Those are often wage and hour policies. But as a former litigator, I can tell you those are evidence. We're creating these policies as evidence because it's always the employer's burden to prove that they complied with the law. And you might think, well, I've got my time cards, but your time cards don't show rest breaks. They don't show that someone got a compliant meal period necessarily. Someone could come back and say, well, I was, someone interrupted me the entire time. So when we write a solid meal and rest break policy, for example, we are shifting some of that burden back to the employee to be accountable for complying with our policies, right? We're saying you've got to tell us if something goes wrong. You have to tell us if you didn't get that meal and rest break you wanted. And in that way, we're creating evidence in case of a later claim. We say, hey, these were our policies. We told you you had to comply with them. And if you don't, or something goes wrong, you have to tell us. And in that sense, the policy becomes this way of us showing, look, we did our best. And if it didn't work, it's on that employee because they never told us there was a problem. So those kinds of policies have a super important evidentiary purpose, as well as just providing guidance to employees.
I just got a call from a client a few minutes ago before we started the podcast, and they just settled a PAGA case for $2 million. And one of the big pieces of evidence that the plaintiffs used to get that settlement was a rest period policy that said they couldn't leave the premises for their rest period. But we all know that's not lawful. So in that case, the policy was used against the employer. So it's going to be evidence either way, right? It's going to be evidence that you've done the right thing or evidence that you've done the wrong thing.
Right. And that's a really great example of a policy that is probably out of date, because a lot of employers did used to assume that rest breaks could be on premises because the courts hadn't really explored that whole off-duty rest break thing, right? So that is about, I think about 5-6 years old. So when we start, forgetting to update our handbook or we only spot edit, that's when we end up with those kinds of problems. So that's a really good example of why we have to not just kind of add in the new stuff, but re-examine our own policies. And so, what we want to do with this webinar is empower the people who want to draft their own policies and take a larger role in preparing their handbook, teach them how to write a good policy, how to revise it, and really what to look for as they change things to make sure that that policy is clear, that it's enforceable, and the kind of behind the scenes things they need to know for implementation and enforcement. And that's one of the big things we'll be talking about is, okay, how do you enforce a policy properly? Of course, we'll also talk about 2025 changes. So I don't want to say we're only talking about these things, but kind of in the context of how do we write our best policies and how do we be aware of what we're really sticking in there so we're not just dumping in new material and hoping for the best.
So, Julia, you review a ton of handbooks and policies every year. Mm-hmm. What are the common problems you see? Like, what do you see employers making the same mistakes over and over and over again? I mean, maybe someone doesn't have time to join the webinar or they're busy that day or whatever, and I want them to get something out of this podcast. What are the things you see, some common issues that we can give folks right now a heads up? Look, if you don't do anything else, think about these things.
That's a really great question. So I would say one of the things that's really difficult to figure out when you're writing a policy is what is your audience? Who should be seeing what part of the policy? So a lot of the time, I think that people feel like they need to put all of the rules and procedures and everything they're going to be doing in the handbook.
The kitchen sink approach, yes. Right?
This is how we handle transfers. This is how we handle promotions. And the first thing I say is think about your audience. So the handbook is intended to be general employment policies for everyone to see. But a lot of what people are trying to put in there are really discretionary, internal, higher level procedures. And what we don't want to do is show how the sausage is made sometimes, right. Because the reality is most of those procedures we don't want to include in the main handbook are ones that are highly discretionary, that really depend on the circumstances. And there's no real way that we can set a clear procedure or rule that's going to make sense in the employee handbook. So, one of those is discipline. We get a lot of clients that really want to have a disciplinary policy in place, and they want to have all these rules around it. And then they run into trouble because, of course, depending on the circumstances, they may not want to follow the rules that they've put in place. And then, of course, they call and say, hey, Julia, but it says I reserve the right to proceed immediately to termination. So, of course, this is fine. And yes, you are saying that, you reserve the right not to follow your own policy. But the reality is when employees see a set of rules, they expect you to follow those rules. And if you don't do it, you depart from it for that particular person, nobody likes to be the exception. And so what we tend to see is when we put all these rules in the handbook relating to discretionary decisions, and you decide to depart from those rules, even though you have the right to do it, employees are going to be upset. They're going to be suspicious, and they're going to claim that they're not being treated the same. So there's really not a great reason to put those kinds of rules in the handbook, especially if the policy you're creating is functionally, this is what we're going to do unless I decide not to. Because that really doesn't give employees any guidance, and it just makes them suspicious when you don't do what they think is the primary set of rules.
That is such a great point, Julia, because we have that language in handbooks and policies and manuals all the time that says, oh, this is not a contract. But of course, your employees think it's a contract. Mm-hmm. If you say you're going to get an annual performance review and we will consider compensation increases at that time, then you better give them an annual performance review and you better consider compensation increases at that time. And if you don't want to, then let's have a policy that says we believe in continuous evaluation of your work product and our ability to meet your needs. And we encourage dialogue, whatever. We can say whatever we want to say, but we don't need to nail it down to, okay, this is what we're going to do unless this is what we want to do. One of the things I love that you tell clients is, look, you put in there what you want employees to do. not what you're going to do. What you're going to do is your own discretion. You're an at-will employer most of the time if you're a private sector employer. Unless you have a union, you're generally going to be an at-will employer. You can do whatever the heck you want as long as it's lawful. So don't bind yourself by the handbook, bind employees by the handbook. So I love your example earlier of, look, if you didn't get a rest break or meal period, you got to tell us because we're putting you on notice that you should be taking them. So if somebody's interfering or somebody's doing something that they shouldn't be doing, you need to let us know. I love that. That is a great thing for people to take away. What about this idea of, look, I'm super busy. I just want to go to a website and I just want to download a copy of some handbook that I can buy for $99. And I know that I shouldn't download one from Iowa if I'm a California employer. But isn't that good enough? Like, can't I just go and download it, keep it easy, slap my logo and my name on it? I mean, what's really wrong with that?
Well, the builder handbooks, they do have a purpose. So if your resources are limited and you need to start with a builder, especially if you're using a California-based one, it's not the end of the world. But where employers go wrong is that they don't take the time to actually check whether the policies make sense for them. So circling back to the case that you just talked about with the rest breaks and where the policy said they had to be on premises, there are certain industries that can do that in the California wage orders. A builder program is not going to know what to do. So what you need to think about is that there are different laws that apply to many different industries. You know, another one is that certain industries have really strict extra Cal OSHA standards. Some will have different standards regarding, you know, background checks and other things. And granted, we don't always see that in the handbook, but you need to be aware of those issues so that you're not just taking a builder and going with it. And the other issue is that a lot of people don't take the time to really tailor it to their policies or to their practices, So, for example, if you have a particular timekeeping program and it requires a very specific type of login, let's say we use a joint iPad at a client site. If your policy is from a builder, it's going to basically say, hey, go into the office and log in on your computer, or it's not going to say anything at all. But you need to give those specific instructions to be able to take advantage of your own policies. The other problem, of course, you know, is if someone does something that doesn't comply with what you want them to do, but the handbook doesn't describe your practices accurately, it's very difficult to go back and say, hey, you violated our policy. And they say, well, that's not what our policy says, right? You actually have to go through and tailor it and also be aware of the laws that might apply to you. And there's also a future part to it that I think that a lot of employers don't notice, which is, let's say you have 14 employees when you download your builder handbook. When you get that 15th employee, there's a bunch of new leaves of absence that apply. So if you download that builder at 14 employees, that's all they're going to ask you. And they may give you the right policies for that, but it's not going to tell you, hey, you need to watch out because when you add that person next month, this handbook's going to be wrong. You know, same with a lot of things. So especially if you're small, if you're less than 5, be very careful with a builder handbook because there are so many obligations that start kicking in very rapidly as you add employees. Or if you have an out-of-state person, that's definitely not going to work. But ultimately, there are limitations to it. So you should view a builder as a template, just a starting point, kind of a skeleton that you need to fill in and make sure it is legally compliant and that it makes sense and is tailored to your actual practices.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously the webinar that you're going to facilitate, which everyone, by the way, is November 14th. So it's coming up quickly. Make sure you register for that on our website. You're going to go through all these issues, Julia. And one of the things that I think is so beneficial to our clients and the friends who join these webinars and our podcasts is just the experience. I mean, we have been working together for so long and you have become an absolute guru in this area. Anytime we get a policy or procedure issue, you know what's going on. You do the multi-state stuff. So you're just amazing. And it is such a pleasure to work with you. And I'm just so glad that you could join me here today. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I look forward to doing the webinar and seeing people on it and answering questions. So we shall see you all soon.
Oh, I love it. Julia, thank you so much. Everyone, thanks for joining us today. Just go to the website. You can register for any of our webinars on there. We, of course, have our legal update coming up as well. Julia, have a great day. Everyone, go out, do something nice for someone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to spread the word, please share it with others, post about it on social media, and/or rate and review it. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and email us at info@shawlawgroup.com.